The howling December wind carried with it a woman's anguished cry, cutting through the endless expanse of the snow-covered Wyoming Territory. Elizabeth Griffith stumbled through knee-deep snow, one hand clutching her swollen belly, the other desperately pulling a threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders. The year was 1873, and as the sun began its descent behind the jagged mountains, Elizabeth knew she and her unborn child wouldn't survive another hour in the merciless cold. Her husband's final words echoed in her mind as cruelly as the wind that bit at her cheeks. "I didn't sign up for a family," he had spat before throwing her meager belongings onto the frozen ground outside the mining camp. 6 months pregnant and miles from the nearest town, Elizabeth had been walking for hours, her fingers and toes long since numb, her tears freezing on her face. A contraction seized her and she fell to her knees with a cry. This couldn't be happening, not here, not now. Her baby wasn't due for another 3 months. Elizabeth tried to stand, but her legs refused to cooperate. The endless white landscape blurred before her eyes as darkness began to creep in from the edges of her vision. "Please," she whispered, though there was no one to hear her plea. "Please help us." As consciousness began to slip away, Elizabeth thought she heard the sound of hoofbeats crunching through the snow. A hallucination, surely the mind's final comfort before death. But then strong arms were lifting her, and a deep voice was speaking words she couldn't understand. The last thing she felt was warmth, beautiful, blessed warmth before the world went black. Miles Walker had been tracking a wounded elk for the better part of the day when he first spotted the dark figure against the pristine snow. Through his spyglass, he recognized the unmistakable form of a woman, and from the way she clutched her belly, one in a family way. What in God's name was a pregnant woman doing out in this God-forsaken wilderness alone? He spurred his horse forward, praying he wasn't too late. By the time he reached her, she was barely conscious, her lips blue, her eyelids fluttering. "Madam, madam, can you hear me?" Miles jumped from his horse and knelt beside her. When she didn't respond, he quickly assessed the situation. She was pregnant, freezing, and if the way she'd been clutching her stomach was any indication, possibly in labor. His cabin was a good hour's ride from here, too far to try carrying her on foot. With practiced efficiency, Miles removed his heavy bearskin coat and wrapped it around her. He then lifted her onto his horse, mounting behind her and cradling her limp body against his chest. "Hold on, madam," he murmured, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. "I'm taking you somewhere safe." The journey back to his cabin seemed to take an eternity. Miles kept one arm firmly around the woman, the other guiding his horse through the treacherous terrain. He could feel her trembling against him, occasionally moaning or whimpering in pain. By the time his cabin came into view, dusk had fallen completely. Miles had never been so grateful to see the sturdy log structure, smoke curling from its chimney where he'd left a fire burning that morning. He dismounted first, then carefully pulled the woman down into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, even with the child she carried. Inside, he laid her gently on his bed, piling every fur and blanket he owned on top of her before stoking the fire to a roaring blaze. Only then, in the warm glow of the firelight, did Miles get his first good look at her face. Despite being pale with cold and pinched with pain, she was beautiful young, with delicate features and hair the color of honey. Her wedding ring glinted in the firelight, raising questions Miles knew would have to wait. As he contemplated what to do next, the woman's eyes suddenly flew open, wide with fear and confusion. She tried to sit up, only to cry out and clutch her belly. "Easy there," Miles said, keeping his voice soft. "You're safe now." "My baby," she gasped, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, my baby's coming." Miles felt a wave of panic. He'd delivered plenty of foals and calves in his time, but never a human child. The nearest doctor was in Laramie, 2 days' ride away in good weather, impossible in this blizzard. "All right," he said, trying to sound calmer than he felt. "I'm going to help you. My name's Miles. What's yours?" "Elizabeth," she managed between ragged breaths. "Elizabeth Griffith." "Elizabeth, I need to check how far along you are. Is that okay?" She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "It's too early," she whispered. The baby's not due till March. Miles swallowed hard, arranging the blankets to preserve her modesty as best he could while still allowing him to help. What he saw confirmed his fears. The baby was indeed coming, and soon. "Elizabeth, your baby's coming tonight. I've helped birth plenty of animals, but never a person. I'm going to do everything I can, but I need you to be strong." She stared at him for a long moment, and Miles saw something shift in her eyes, fear giving way to determination. She nodded once, then grimaced as another contraction took hold. The next 6 hours were the longest of Miles's life. He boiled water, tore up his cleanest shirt for rags, and helped Elizabeth through each increasingly painful contraction. She was stronger than anyone he'd ever met, biting down on a folded piece of leather rather than screaming when the pain became unbearable. As midnight approached, the moment finally came. With one last heroic push from Elizabeth, Miles found himself holding a tiny, squirming infant, a girl, impossibly small but undeniably alive. "You have a daughter," he told Elizabeth, his voice thick with emotion as he quickly wrapped the baby in a soft rabbit fur he'd been saving to make gloves. The child let out a weak cry, the most beautiful sound Miles had ever heard. Elizabeth reached out trembling arms, and Miles carefully placed the infant against her chest. "She's so small," Elizabeth whispered, tears flowing freely now, "but she's fighting," Miles said, "just like her mama." Outside, the blizzard raged on, but inside the cabin, a strange kind of peace had settled. Miles busied himself cleaning up, giving Elizabeth some privacy with her daughter. When he returned with some warm broth, he found them both asleep, the baby nestled securely against her mother's breast. Something shifted in Miles's heart as he watched them, something he couldn't name, but recognized as important. These two strangers had stumbled into his life through the most unlikely of circumstances, and somehow he already knew nothing would ever be the same. He settled into his chair by the fire, prepared to watch over them through the night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now they were safe. For now, that was enough. Elizabeth woke to unfamiliar surroundings, and a moment of panic before the events of the previous day came rushing back. The cold, the pain, the stranger who had saved her life and her baby. With a jolt of fear, she looked down, relieved to find her daughter still sleeping peacefully against her. "Good morning," came a deep voice from across the room. Elizabeth turned to see Miles sitting at her rough-hewn table, a steaming mug in his hands. In the light of day, she could see him clearly for the first time, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and wind, but kind eyes the color of a summer sky. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30 or so. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Sore," Elizabeth admitted. "But alive, thanks to you." Miles shook his head. "You did all the hard work. I just helped where I could." The baby stirred then, making tiny mewling sounds that sent a wave of love and fear through Elizabeth. She was so small, so fragile. Born too early, miles from civilization, in the dead of winter. What chance did she have? As if reading her thoughts, Miles approached with a cup of something hot. "It's willow bark tea," he explained, "for the pain, and I've made some broth that should help you regain your strength." "Thank you," Elizabeth said, accepting the cup. "For everything. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found us." "No need to think about that now," Miles replied, his eyes dropping to the baby. "She's a beautiful little thing. Have you thought of a name?" Elizabeth looked down at her daughter's tiny face. "Hope," she said softly. "Her name is Hope." Miles smiled. "It suits her." A comfortable silence fell between them as Elizabeth sipped her tea. Finally, she asked the question that had been weighing on her mind. "What happens now?" Miles sat on the edge of the bed, careful to keep a respectful distance. "Well, you and Hope are welcome to stay here until you're strong enough to travel. My cabin's not much, but it's warm and safe." And then, Elizabeth couldn't keep the tremor from her voice. "That depends on where you want to go," Miles said gently. "Is there someone waiting for you somewhere?" "Your husband, perhaps?" Elizabeth looked down at the wedding ring she still wore out of habit. "No," she said, her voice hardening. "My husband made it very clear he wants nothing to do with me or the baby." Miles's expression darkened momentarily. "I see any family nearby?" "None that would take me in. My parents died when I was 16. I came west with my husband 2 years ago when he got work at the silver mine in Silver Creek. She hesitated, then added, he didn't want children. When he found out I was expecting, things changed. Yesterday he put us out. Said he wouldn't support another man's child. Another man's, Miles stopped himself. I'm sorry, that's none of my business. It's not true, Elizabeth said firmly, needing him to understand. Hope is his child. I've never been with anyone else, but Thomas convinced himself otherwise. He couldn't accept that our life was changing. Miles nodded, his jaw tight with barely contained anger. Well, you and Hope are welcome here for as long as you need, at least until spring when the pass is clear. I can't impose on you like that, Elizabeth protested. It's December. Spring is months away. Look outside, Mrs. Griffith, Miles said, gesturing to the window where snow was still falling heavily. We're 20 miles from the nearest town and the passes won't be clear for anyone, let alone a woman with a newborn, until the thaw. Like it or not, you're stuck with me for a while. Elizabeth felt tears threatening again. Why would you do this for strangers? Miles was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. My ma always said God puts people in our path for a reason. Maybe I was meant to find you yesterday. Maybe you and Hope were meant to be here, he shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. Besides, it gets lonely out here. It'll be nice having someone to talk to besides my horse. Hope began to fuss in earnest then, her tiny face scrunching up in hunger. Elizabeth adjusted her nightgown to feed her, and Miles respectfully turned away, busying himself at the stove. I'll make us some breakfast, he said. You need to keep up your strength. As Elizabeth nursed her daughter, she studied the cabin that would be their home for the foreseeable future. It was small but solid, with a stone fireplace at one end and a few sturdy pieces of furniture that looked handmade. Furs and blankets were stacked in a corner, and dried herbs hung from the rafters. Through a door, she could see what appeared to be a small storeroom. It was rustic but clean and warm, far better than anything she could have hoped for when she'd been stumbling through the snow. Have you lived here long? She asked, breaking the silence. Miles looked up from the pan where he was frying salt pork. Going on 5 years now. Built it myself after I got tired of driving cattle for other men. You're a cowboy then, he corrected. Now I trap, hunt, and do some trading with the Shoshone when they come through. I guide hunting parties in the summer sometimes. It's enough to get by. All alone, Miles nodded. Just me and Thunder, that's my horse. Had a dog for a while, but he passed last winter. He dished up the salt pork alongside some beans and brought a plate over to Elizabeth. It's not fancy, but it's filling. It looks wonderful, Elizabeth said sincerely. I haven't eaten since. Well, since before, they ate in companionable silence, interrupted only by Hope's occasional sounds. When they finished, Miles took the plates and set them in a basin of water. You should rest more, he said. I need to check my trap lines and take care of the horses, but I won't go far. There's more tea if you want it, and plenty of firewood beside the hearth. Thank you, Elizabeth said again, feeling inadequate in the face of such kindness. Miles pulled on his coat and hat, then paused at the door. Mrs. Griffith, Elizabeth, please, he nodded. Elizabeth. I know this isn't what you planned, and I know you don't know me from Adam, but I want you to know that you and Hope are safe here. Whatever happens next, we'll figure it out together. With that, he was gone, leaving Elizabeth alone with her daughter and a strange feeling in her chest, something like hope, something like fear, and something else she couldn't quite name. The next few days fell into a rhythm. Miles would rise before dawn, stoke the fire, and slip out to tend to his chores. By the time Elizabeth woke, there would be fresh coffee brewing and often something cooking for breakfast. They would eat together, Miles telling stories of his life in the West while Elizabeth nursed Hope. Then he would head out again, checking his trap lines or hunting, while Elizabeth rested and cared for the baby. In the evenings, they would share another meal, and Miles would read aloud from one of the few books he owned, mostly practical guides to wilderness survival, but also a well-worn copy of The Last of the Mohicans that had been his father's. On the 4th day, Elizabeth insisted on getting up. You need to rest, Miles protested when he found her trying to sweep the floor, Hope bundled in a sling Miles had fashioned from a soft deerskin. I've been resting for days, Elizabeth countered. I can't just lie about while you do everything. Besides, I'm feeling much stronger. Miles looked like he wanted to argue but thought better of it. At least let me help you with that, he said, taking the broom. Why don't you sit at the table? There's something I've been meaning to show you. Curious, Elizabeth settled at the table. Miles disappeared into the storeroom and returned with a wooden crate which he placed before her. I've been saving these, he explained, somewhat awkwardly. Thought they might come in handy someday. Elizabeth opened the crate to find baby clothes, small gowns, booties, and blankets, all lovingly hand-stitched. Miles, these are beautiful. Where did they come from? Miles ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Elizabeth had come to recognize as a sign of discomfort. They were my sisters. She and her husband were heading to Oregon a few years back. They stopped here on their way. She was expecting there first. His voice grew quieter. They never made it to Oregon. Cholera took them both somewhere in Idaho Territory. Her husband's family sent me her things after. Oh, Miles, Elizabeth breathed, her heart aching for his loss. I can't take these, they're too precious. That's exactly why you should have them, Miles insisted. Jenny would have wanted them to be used, not sitting in a box gathering dust. Besides, Hope needs them more than I do. Elizabeth ran her fingers over a tiny gown of soft flannel. Thank you, we'll take good care of them. Miles nodded, visibly relieved. They might be a bit big for her now, but she'll grow into them. She will, Elizabeth agreed, though the worry that had been her constant companion since Hope's birth surfaced again. The baby was so small, so frail. Each day she lived seemed like a miracle, but Elizabeth couldn't shake the fear that it wouldn't last. As if sensing her thoughts, Miles said, She's getting stronger every day, you both are. Elizabeth smiled gratefully. It's thanks to you. I don't know how I'll ever repay your kindness. Having company through the winter is payment enough, Miles assured her. He hesitated, then added, I was thinking when you're feeling up to it, maybe I could teach you a few things: how to shoot, how to track, basic survival skills. Things that might come in handy out here. I'd like that, Elizabeth said, surprised by how much she meant it. The Elizabeth of before the miner's obedient wife who had never questioned her place seemed like a different person now. This new Elizabeth, mother to Hope, survivor of abandonment and near death, wanted to learn everything she could. Miles looked pleased. Good. We'll start tomorrow if you're up for it. That night, as a particularly fierce wind howled outside, Elizabeth found herself unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. Hope was finally resting peacefully in a cradle Miles had crafted from a wooden crate lined with the softest furs. Elizabeth slipped from the bed, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, and moved to the window. The world outside was a swirling chaos of white, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. It occurred to her that had Miles not found her, she and Hope would be out there somewhere, 2 more bodies for the spring thaw to reveal. The thought made her shudder. Can't sleep. Miles's voice came quietly from where he was stretched out on a bedroll near the fire. No, Elizabeth admitted. The wind. Miles sat up. It takes some getting used to. Sounds like the whole world's trying to get in sometimes. Does it frighten you, being so isolated out here? Miles considered this. Not frightened exactly, respectful, I guess. Nature demands respect out here. The mountains, the weather, the animals, they were here long before us, and they'll be here long after. A man who doesn't respect that doesn't last long. Elizabeth nodded, understanding. I was scared of everything before, the dark, being alone, what people might think of me. Now I've faced the worst that could happen, and I'm still here. It changes how you see things. That it does, Miles agreed. Fear's still there, but it's different, more about protecting what matters than worrying what might happen. What matters to you, Miles? Elizabeth asked, surprised by her own boldness. In the dim light of the dying fire, she saw him smile slightly. Simpler things than most, I suppose. Freedom, peace, doing right by others when I can. He paused. What about you? Hope, Elizabeth answered without hesitation. Making sure she has a better life than I did, being the kind of mother she deserves. She looked down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring unconsciously. I used to think love was enough, that if I just loved Thomas enough, everything would work out. I was wrong. Some men don't deserve the love they're given, Miles said, his voice hardening briefly before softening again. But that doesn't mean love itself isn't enough. Just has to be the right kind between the right people. Their eyes met across the room, and Elizabeth felt something shift between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits finding each other in the vast wilderness. Then hope stirred in her cradle, breaking the moment. "You should try to sleep," Miles said gently. "Morning comes early, and if you're still set on those shooting lessons, you'll need your rest." Elizabeth nodded, returning to the bed. "Good night, Miles. Good night, Elizabeth." As she drifted off to sleep, Elizabeth realized she had removed her wedding ring and placed it on the small table beside the bed, a small act of liberation that felt enormously significant. The winter days passed with surprising swiftness. True to his word, Miles began teaching Elizabeth the skills she would need to survive in the wilderness. She learned to shoot his old Spencer rifle and the Colt revolver he kept for emergencies. Her first attempts were embarrassingly off target, but Miles was a patient teacher, and gradually her aim improved. "You're a natural," he told her one crisp January morning after she hit the makeshift target 3 times in a row. "Better than most men I've taught." Elizabeth couldn't help the pride that swelled in her chest. "It feels good," she admitted, "being able to protect myself to protect Hope." Miles nodded approvingly. "That's exactly why it matters. Out here, self-reliance isn't just admirable, it's necessary." He taught her other skills as well: how to dress game, how to identify edible plants, how to read the weather from the clouds and wind. Elizabeth soaked up the knowledge eagerly, finding a strange satisfaction in these practical tasks that she had never experienced in her previous life. For his part, Miles seemed to thrive with company. He smiled more readily, laughed often, and revealed a gentle side that came out most strongly with Hope. He would hold the baby while Elizabeth rested, his large hands cradling her tiny form with surprising tenderness. He fashioned toys for her: a rattle made from a hollow gourd filled with pebbles, a stuffed rabbit from scraps of fur, and spoke to her in soft, serious tones, as if she understood every word. "You're good with her," Elizabeth observed one evening as Miles gently rocked Hope, who had been fussy with colic. Miles looked up, a hint of color touching his cheeks. "She makes it easy, smart little thing, sees everything with those big eyes of hers." "She likes you," Elizabeth said. "She settles faster for you than for me sometimes." "That's just because my voice is deeper, vibrates differently." Miles carefully adjusted Hope's position. "My sister used to say babies can sense goodness in people. If that's true, she knows her mama's the best there is." Elizabeth felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. These moments of connection between them were happening more frequently: small compliments, lingering glances, hands brushing as they passed dishes at meals. She found herself looking forward to their evenings together, when the day's work was done and they could simply talk. She learned that Miles had grown up in Missouri, the son of a blacksmith. He had headed west at 17, working as a cowhand on various ranches before serving briefly as a scout for the Army. He had built his cabin and staked his claim to this valley after growing weary of answering to others and witnessing the often brutal treatment of the native peoples. "I wanted a place where I could live by my own code," he explained, "where right and wrong weren't determined by whoever had the most money or the most guns." "And have you found that here?" Elizabeth asked. Miles looked thoughtful. "Mostly. It's not perfect, nothing is. But I sleep better knowing I'm not causing harm to others by my choices." "That's more than most can say," Elizabeth observed. One night in late January, a particularly severe blizzard descended upon the valley. The wind screamed around the cabin like a living thing, finding every crack and crevice. Despite the roaring fire, a bone-deep cold permeated the small space. "I don't like this," Miles said, peering out the window at the impenetrable darkness. "Storm feels wrong somehow." As if in response, a tremendous cracking sound came from above, and part of the roof gave way under the weight of accumulated snow. Cold air and snow poured in, immediately dropping the temperature in the cabin. "Get Hope," Miles shouted over the howling wind. Elizabeth was already moving, snatching her daughter from the cradle and wrapping her in layers of blankets. Miles grabbed his tools and was on a chair in an instant, trying to secure a piece of canvas over the gap. "It's no use," he called down. "I can't fix it properly until the storm passes. We need to move to the storeroom. It's smaller and the roof's newer." The storeroom was indeed smaller, no more than 8 feet square, with supplies stacked around the edges. Miles quickly cleared a space in the center and laid down furs and blankets. "It's going to get cold in here," he warned, moving the lantern to a safe spot. "We'll need to share body heat to stay warm." Elizabeth nodded, understanding the necessity. She sat on the makeshift bed, hope clutched to her chest. Miles settled beside them, then hesitated. "I should check on Thunder and the mule," he said, starting to rise. Elizabeth caught his arm. "Miles, you can't go out in this. You said yourself it's not a normal storm." "The lean-to might not hold," he argued. "If something happens to the horses, then we'll deal with it," Elizabeth said firmly. "But Hope and I need you here now." Something in her voice must have convinced him, because after a moment, Miles nodded and sat back down. He arranged the blankets around them, then, with obvious awkwardness, put his arm around Elizabeth's shoulders. "Is this all right?" he asked. "Yes," Elizabeth said softly. "It's all right." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside. Hope, remarkably, had slept through the commotion and now nestled contentedly between them. Eventually, Miles spoke. "I never thought I'd have this," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Have what?" "Someone to worry about, someone who worries about me." He paused. "A family, I guess, even if it's just temporary." Elizabeth felt her heart constrict at his words. She had been thinking of their arrangement as temporary to a necessity until spring came and she could move on to. Where? She realized with a start that she had no plans, no destination in mind. "Does it have to be temporary?" she asked, the words escaping before she could reconsider them. Miles went very still beside her. "What do you mean?" Elizabeth took a deep breath. "I mean I have nowhere to go, Miles. No family, no home. Hope and I were alone in the world except for you." "Elizabeth, let me finish," she said, needing to get the words out. "These past weeks have been the strangest of my life, but also, in some ways, the best. I've learned more about myself, about what I'm capable of. I've seen a different way of living, one that has purpose and meaning." She looked up at him. "And I've seen the kind of man you are, kind, honorable, strong in all the ways that matter, the kind of man I wish Hope could know as her father." Miles's eyes widened, and for a terrible moment, Elizabeth thought she had misjudged everything. Then his hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch impossibly gentle. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm saying I don't want to leave when spring comes," Elizabeth whispered. "I'm saying that if you want us, if you could see yourself loving Hope as your own, loving me in time, we could be a real family, not just temporarily." Miles closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, they shone with a brightness that had nothing to do with the lantern light. "Elizabeth, I already love Hope as if she were my own, and you," he swallowed hard, "you must know I've been falling in love with you since the moment you opened your eyes in my cabin." Elizabeth felt tears well up, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. "I think I've been falling in love with you too. I just didn't know if you could feel the same, given how we met, given Hope." "Hope is a blessing," Miles said firmly. "And how we met was God's doing. I'm certain of it now. I've been alone for so long, Elizabeth. The thought of you both leaving has been like a knife in my heart." "Then ask us to stay," she whispered. Miles took her free hand in his. "Elizabeth Griffith, will you and Hope stay here with me? Will you let me love you both, protect you, provide for you? Will you be my family, now and always?" "Yes," Elizabeth said, her voice strong despite her tears. "Yes to all of it." Miles leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, but Elizabeth met him halfway, her lips finding his in a kiss that felt like coming home after a long journey. It was gentle at first, tentative, but deepened as the last barriers between them fell away. When they finally parted, breathless hope stirred between them, making the soft cooing sounds that were her version of contentment. They both looked down at her, then back at each other and smiled. "Family," Miles said, the word reverent on his lips. "Family," Elizabeth echoed, feeling the truth of it settle in her bones, more permanent than any wedding vow. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside their small sanctuary, a different kind of power had taken hold, the quiet, unstoppable force of love finding its way in the most unlikely of circumstances. The storm lasted 3 days, trapping them in the storeroom for the duration. They emerged to find the cabin damaged but repairable. The lean-to had partially collapsed, but miraculously, both Thunder and the mule had survived unharmed, huddled together for warmth. Miles set about repairing the roof immediately, while Elizabeth cleaned up the snow and water that had infiltrated their living space. By nightfall, the cabin was habitable again, though decidedly drafty in spots. "It'll hold until spring," Miles declared as they sat by the fire that evening. "Then I'll put on a proper new roof." Elizabeth nodded, hope sleeping peacefully in her arms. "We could expand a bit too," she suggested. "Add another room perhaps." Miles looked up from the bridle he was mending, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I like the way you think. Maybe a proper bedroom for us and a small one for Hope when she's older. And any brothers or sisters she might have," Elizabeth added softly. Miles's hands stilled. "Brothers and sisters," Elizabeth felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "Well, not right away, of course, but someday if you wanted." Miles was beside her in an instant, the bridle forgotten. "I want everything with you, Elizabeth, everything a man and woman can have together." He kissed her then, a kiss full of promise and barely restrained desire. Elizabeth responded eagerly, her free arm wrapping around his neck to pull him closer. "When Hope's a bit older," Miles murmured against her lips, "when you're fully recovered, I want to marry you proper if you'll have me." "I'll have you," Elizabeth assured him. "Though I'm not sure how we'll manage a proper wedding out here. There's a circuit preacher who comes through the valley every few months," Miles explained. "Brother Johnson, good man, he'd marry us." The thought of becoming Mrs. Miles Walker sent a thrill through Elizabeth. "Yes," she said. "As soon as he comes, we'll marry." February gave way to March, and with it came the first hints of spring. The snow began to recede, revealing patches of brown earth. Birds returned to the valley, their songs a welcome change from the winter silence. Hope grew stronger every day, her cheeks filling out, her gaze becoming more alert and curious. Miles and Elizabeth settled into a partnership that felt as natural as breathing. They worked side by side during the days tending to the animals, preparing for spring planting, hunting and fishing as the weather allowed. At night, they shared the bed. Miles had enlarged and improved, holding each other close but respecting Elizabeth's need to fully heal before becoming intimate. One crisp March morning, Miles returned from checking his trap lines with unusual excitement. "Brother Johnson's in the valley," he announced. "Staying with the Hendersons over by the creek. He'll be heading our way tomorrow." Elizabeth's heart leapt. "Tomorrow." "But I'm not prepared. I don't have anything suitable to wear, and there's no time to." Miles silenced her with a gentle kiss. "You could wear a potato sack and still be the most beautiful bride in Wyoming Territory." Elizabeth laughed, swatting his arm playfully. "That's easy for you to say. You're not the one getting married in a potato sack." "I do have something for you, though," Miles said, suddenly serious. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in a handkerchief. "It was my mother's. My pa gave it to me before he died, said to save it for when I found the right woman." Elizabeth unwrapped the handkerchief to reveal a simple gold band with a small pearl set in the center. "Oh, Miles," she breathed. "It's beautiful." "Not as beautiful as you," he said, taking the ring and sliding it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. "Now you're properly engaged." Elizabeth looked down at her hand, where the new ring had replaced her old wedding band, which now resided in a small box with other remnants of her previous life. "It feels right," she said, "like it belongs there." "Like you belong here," Miles said, pulling her close. "With me." The next day dawned clear and bright, as if nature herself approved of their union. Elizabeth wore the best of the dresses Miles had procured for her from a trading post during one of his infrequent trips for supplies, a simple blue calico that complemented her eyes. She had fashioned a small wreath of early spring flowers to wear in her hair, and Hope was dressed in one of the gowns from Miles's sister, looking like a miniature angel. Brother Johnson arrived mid-morning, a jovial man with a bushy beard and kind eyes. "Well now," he said after introductions had been made and the situation explained, "this is a day for rejoicing indeed. The Lord works in mysterious ways, bringing you two together through such circumstances." The ceremony was simple but meaningful, conducted before the fireplace in the cabin that had become their home. Miles had invited the Hendersons and the Blackfeet family, who sometimes camped in the valley, the closest thing they had to neighbors. Mrs. Henderson had brought a cake made with precious sugar saved for special occasions, and everyone contributed something to the celebratory meal that followed. "I, Miles Walker, take thee, Elizabeth Griffith, to be my lawfully wedded wife," Miles said, his voice steady and sure as he held Elizabeth's hands in his. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." When Elizabeth repeated the vows, her voice trembled with emotion, but her eyes never left Miles's face. "With this ring I thee wed," she said, sliding a simple band Miles had fashioned from silver onto his finger. "By the authority vested in me by God in the territory of Wyoming, I now pronounce you husband and wife," Brother Johnson declared. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. You may kiss your bride." Miles pulled Elizabeth close, one hand cradling the back of her head as he kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. Around them, their small gathering of guests applauded and cheered. "Mrs. Walker," Miles whispered when they parted. "Mr. Walker," Elizabeth replied, her heart so full she thought it might burst. Hope, who had been contentedly watching from Mrs. Henderson's arms, chose that moment to let out a happy gurgle, as if adding her own approval to the proceedings. That night, after their guests had departed and Hope was sleeping soundly in her cradle, Miles and Elizabeth stood in the doorway of their cabin, looking out at the star-filled sky. "Happy?" Miles asked, his arm around Elizabeth's waist. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she answered truthfully. "Are you?" Miles turned her to face him, his expression serious. "Elizabeth, when I found you in that snowstorm, I thought I was saving you and Hope, but the truth is, you saved me too. I was existing out here, not living. Now I have a purpose, a future." He touched her cheek gently. "I have love. What more could a man ask for?" "Nothing," Elizabeth said, rising on tiptoe to kiss him, "because we have everything we need right here." Later, in the privacy of their bed, husband and wife came together for the first time, their bodies joining as their hearts already had. Miles was gentle, mindful of Elizabeth's still healing body, but the passion between them had been building for months and would not be denied. They moved together in the age-old rhythm, whispering words of love and promise as they discovered each other in this most intimate way. Afterward, as they lay entwined, Elizabeth rested her head on Miles's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I love you, Miles Walker," she whispered. "And I love you, Elizabeth Walker," he replied, his arms tightening around her. Now and always. Spring bloomed fully across the valley, bringing with it new life and new possibilities. Miles and Elizabeth worked from dawn to dusk, planting a larger garden than Miles had ever attempted before, repairing winter damage to the cabin, and beginning construction on the addition they had planned. Hope thrived in the mountain air, growing stronger and more alert with each passing day. By June, she was trying to roll over, her eyes tracking movement with increasing precision, her smile lighting up whenever she saw Miles or Elizabeth. "She's going to be walking before we know it," Miles observed one evening as they sat on the porch he had built, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "And talking," Elizabeth added. "Heaven help us when she starts asking questions." Miles laughed. "She'll be as curious and clever as her mama." "And as kind and brave as her papa," Elizabeth countered, leaning against his shoulder. Miles still marveled sometimes at how easily Elizabeth had bestowed that title on him, how naturally Hope had become his daughter in every way that mattered. He had formally adopted her shortly after their wedding, Brother Johnson helping with the necessary paperwork. Hope Walker, the documents now read, daughter of Miles and Elizabeth Walker. Summer brought more changes. The addition to the cabin was completed a proper bedroom for them and a small nursery for Hope, with windows that caught the morning sun. Elizabeth had planted flowers around the cabin, adding splashes of color to the rustic setting. Miles had built a proper corral for the horses and acquired 2 milk cows and a small flock of chickens from a family moving west. Their little homestead was flourishing, becoming more self-sufficient with each passing month. They still made occasional trips to the nearest town for supplies they couldn't produce themselves, but these journeys were infrequent partly due to the distance, partly because they were simply content in their mountain valley. One crisp September morning, as Miles returned from hunting with a brace of rabbits for the stew pot, he found Elizabeth sitting on the porch steps, an odd expression on her face. "Everything all right?" he asked, setting down his gear. Elizabeth looked up, a slow smile spreading across her face. "More than all right," she said. "Miles, I'm with child." Miles froze, the words taking a moment to register. Then he was moving, dropping to his knees before her, his hands reaching for hers. "A baby, you're sure?" Elizabeth nodded, her eyes shining. "As sure as I can be." "It's early yet, the baby won't come until spring, but all the signs are there." "A spring baby," Miles said wonderingly, placing a gentle hand on Elizabeth's still flat stomach. "Hope will have a little brother or sister." "Are you happy?" Elizabeth asked, suddenly uncertain. "I know we talked about more children someday, but perhaps this is sooner than you." Miles silenced her with a kiss. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," he said when they parted. "Elizabeth, you've given me everything I never knew I wanted: a wife, a daughter, a real home, and now another child. I'm the luckiest man in Wyoming Territory." Elizabeth's face softened with relief and joy. "And I'm the luckiest woman. To think, a year ago I was alone and afraid, cast out with nowhere to go. Now look at us, a family, a home, a future." Miles helped her to her feet, wrapping his arms around her. "A future that gets brighter every day," he agreed. "Because of you, because of us." Inside the cabin, Hope began to cry, awake from her nap and ready for attention. Miles and Elizabeth exchanged a smile, then walked hand in hand to tend to their daughter, the first miracle that had brought them together, but not the last that would bless their lives in the wilderness they now called home. The winter of 1874 was milder than the previous year, for which Elizabeth was grateful. As her pregnancy progressed, she found herself tiring more easily, though she insisted on keeping up with most of her usual tasks. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever known," Miles told her one afternoon when he caught her trying to move a heavy basket of dried corn. "You wouldn't have me any other way," Elizabeth retorted, reluctantly allowing him to take the basket. "True enough," Miles conceded with a grin. "But I would have you rest a bit more, for the baby's sake if not your own." Elizabeth sighed, placing a hand on her growing belly. "I just don't want to be a burden." Miles set down the basket and took her face in his hands. "Elizabeth Walker, you could never be a burden. You're my wife, my partner, the mother of my children. Let me take care of you sometimes, the way you always take care of us." Put that way, Elizabeth couldn't argue. She allowed herself to be led to the rocking chair Miles had crafted for her birthday, where Hope was already playing with her wooden blocks on a blanket nearby. At 15 months, Hope was a bundle of energy and curiosity. She had taken her first steps just after Christmas, and now toddled everywhere, exploring her world with fearless enthusiasm. Her honey-colored hair had grown into soft curls, and her eyes, originally the unfocused blue of all newborns, had settled into a warm brown that reminded Elizabeth of her own mother's eyes. "Mama," Hope called, holding up a block triumphantly. "Yes, sweetheart, that's your block," Elizabeth acknowledged. "Can you stack it on top of the others?" Hope considered this challenge, then carefully placed the block on top of the small tower she had already built. When it stayed in place, she clapped her hands in delight. "Smart as a whip, that one," Miles observed proudly. "Takes after her mama." "And stubborn as a mule," Elizabeth added. "Takes after her papa." Miles laughed, not bothering to deny it. He knelt beside Hope, helping her build the tower higher, his large hands gentle as they guided her smaller ones. Elizabeth watched them, her heart full to bursting with love for this man who had become everything to her husband, father to her children, partner in all things. The baby kicked then, a strong movement that made Elizabeth gasp slightly. Miles looked up, concern crossing his face. "The baby's just active today," she assured him. "Here, feel." Miles placed his hand where Elizabeth indicated, his expression transforming to wonder as he felt the life moving within her. "Strong," he murmured, "like Hope was." "Like Hope is," Elizabeth corrected, smiling as their daughter abandoned her blocks to pat Elizabeth's belly, a habit she had developed in recent months. "Baby," Hope said solemnly, one of the dozen or so words she now used regularly. "That's right, sweetheart," Miles said. "Your baby brother or sister is in there." "Sister," Hope declared with the certainty only a toddler could muster. Miles and Elizabeth exchanged amused glances. "We'll see," Elizabeth said diplomatically. In truth, she didn't care whether the baby was a boy or girl as long as it was healthy. After Hope's early arrival, Elizabeth couldn't help worrying about this pregnancy, though everything seemed to be progressing normally. As if reading her thoughts, Miles said, "Everything's going to be fine. This little one is going to arrive right on schedule, healthy and strong." "How can you be so sure?" Elizabeth asked. Miles smiled, the smile that still made her heart skip a beat after all this time. "Because this baby has you for a mother, and you, Elizabeth Walker, can do anything you set your mind to." Spring arrived in a rush of melting snow and new growth. The valley transformed almost overnight from white to green, wildflowers carpeting the meadows, birds building nests in every available tree. As April turned to May, Elizabeth's time grew near. Unlike with Hope, whose early arrival had been preceded by fear and cold, Elizabeth awaited this birth with calm anticipation. Miles had arranged for Mrs. Henderson to come stay with them for the delivery, as she had experience midwifing and lived closest. Everything was prepared clean linens, the cradle brought out of storage and placed near their bed, tiny clothes washed and ready on a perfect May morning, with sunlight streaming through the windows and the scent of wildflowers in the air. Elizabeth's labor began. Miles sent their nearest neighbor's son riding for Mrs. Henderson, then set about making Elizabeth as comfortable as possible. "Remember to breathe," he coached, holding her hand through the contractions. "Just like we practiced." Elizabeth nodded, focusing on her breathing as the pain ebbed and flowed. Hope was with them, unusually subdued as if sensing the importance of the day. She patted Elizabeth's hand solemnly. "Mama hurt." "Mama is working very hard to bring your baby brother or sister into the world," Miles explained. "But she's strong, isn't she?" Hope nodded vigorously. "Mama's strong." Elizabeth managed a smile despite the pain. "That's right, little one, Mama's strong." Mrs. Henderson arrived an hour later, taking charge with brisk efficiency. "This isn't your first rodeo," she told Miles with approval as she examined her setup. "You've got everything ready, I see." "We try to be prepared," Miles said, reluctantly allowing himself to be shooed from the room. "Pa," Hope said, reaching for him. Miles scooped her up, grateful for the distraction. "Let's go check on the chickens, little bug," he suggested. "Let Mama and Mrs. Henderson do their work." The labor progressed steadily throughout the day. Unlike Hope's birth, which had been fraught with danger and urgency, this one unfolded with textbook precision. By early evening, Mrs. Henderson was calling for Miles. "Come meet your son," she said, her weathered face wreathed in smiles. Miles entered the bedroom with Hope in his arms, his heart pounding. Elizabeth sat propped up in bed, tired but radiant, a small bundle cradled against her chest. "A boy?" Miles asked, his voice catching. Elizabeth nodded, her eyes shining with tears of joy. "A perfect, healthy boy." Miles approached slowly, almost reverently. The baby was larger than Hope had been at birth, with a shock of dark hair and the red, wrinkled face of all newborns. As Miles watched, the infant yawned, tiny fists waving. "He's beautiful," Miles whispered, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed. "Hello, son." Hope leaned forward in Miles's arms, studying the newcomer with intense curiosity. "Baby," she announced, reaching out a tentative finger to touch her brother's cheek. "That's right, Hope," Elizabeth said. "This is your baby brother. His name is Michael." "Michael," Miles repeated, testing the name they had chosen if the baby was a boy. "Michael Thomas Walker." After your father and mine, Elizabeth confirmed. They had agreed on the middle name as a way of honoring Elizabeth's past, acknowledging that, without her first marriage, however painful its end had been, she would never have found her way to Miles. Would you like to hold him? Elizabeth asked. Miles nodded, carefully transferring Hope to the bed beside Elizabeth before taking his son into his arms. The feeling was indescribable, this new life, this perfect blend of himself and Elizabeth, this miracle that completed their family in ways he hadn't known were missing. "Hello, Michael," Miles said softly. "Welcome to the world, son. You've got quite a family waiting for you, a brave mama, a spirited big sister, and a pa who's going to teach you everything he knows." The baby's eyes opened then, unfocused but seeming to look straight at Miles. In that moment, Miles felt the final piece of his heart lock into place, a heart that had once been lonely and guarded, now full to overflowing with love for Elizabeth, Hope, and this new little life in his arms. "Our family," Elizabeth said, her hand finding Miles's knee. "Complete." Miles looked at her, at Hope curled against her side, at Michael in his arms. "Complete," he agreed, "and perfect in every way." Mrs. Henderson slipped quietly from the room, leaving the family to their private joy. Outside, the sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, a fitting end to a day that had brought new life and new beginnings. Later that night, after Hope had been tucked into her bed and Michael was sleeping peacefully in his cradle, Miles and Elizabeth lay together, her head on his chest, his arms around her. "Happy?" he asked, echoing the question he had asked on their wedding night. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," Elizabeth answered, tilting her face up to his. "When I think of where I was 2 years ago and where I am now, it doesn't seem real sometimes." "It's real," Miles assured her, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "As real as this cabin, as real as Hope and Michael, as real as my love for you." Elizabeth sighed contentedly. "Remember that first night in the storeroom during the blizzard, when you said you never thought you'd have a family?" "I remember," Miles said. "I meant it. I'd given up on ever having what other men had, a wife, children, a true home. I thought my life would always be solitary. And now," Miles smiled in the darkness, "now I can't imagine any other life. You and the children, this land, our home, it's everything to me. More than I ever dreamed of having." "It's the same for me," Elizabeth said. "When Thomas cast me out, I thought my life was over. I couldn't see a future for Hope or myself, but now—" She placed her hand over Miles's heart, feeling its steady beat beneath her palm. "Now I see endless possibilities. Years of watching our children grow, building our home, loving each other." "Years and years," Miles agreed. "A lifetime together." They fell silent, content in each other's arms, listening to the gentle breathing of their newborn son. Outside, a lone wolf howled in the distance, its call echoing across the valley that had become their kingdom. Inside, wrapped in warmth and love, the Walker family slept, secure in the knowledge that they had found in each other everything they would ever need. Epilogue: 10 years later, the summer sun beat down on the valley, turning the meadow grass golden and warming the clear waters of the creek to a pleasant temperature. By the water's edge, Elizabeth sat sketching, her practiced eye capturing the scene before her, Miles teaching 11-year-old Hope and 9-year-old Michael how to fish, while 6-year-old Emma and 4-year-old Joshua splashed in the shallows. The years had been kind to them all. The small cabin had grown into a proper ranch house, with multiple bedrooms, a large kitchen, and even a small schoolroom where Elizabeth taught the children their lessons. Their herd of cattle numbered in the dozens now, and their vegetable garden had expanded into proper fields of wheat and corn. They were prosperous by frontier standards, though their greatest wealth, as Miles often said, was in their family. Hope had grown into a beautiful young girl with her mother's honey-colored hair and a spirit as wild and free as the mountains around them. She was skilled with horses, fearless on a hunt, but also had her mother's love of books and learning. Michael, serious and thoughtful like his father, was already showing a talent for working with his hands, helping Miles with building projects around the ranch. Emma, their surprise blessing 3 years after Michael, had inherited her mother's artistic abilities and spent hours drawing alongside Elizabeth. And little Joshua, the spitting image of Miles with his dark hair and blue eyes, was a bundle of energy who kept them all on their toes. "Mama, look," Hope called, holding up a wriggling trout. "I caught the biggest one." "Well done, sweetheart," Elizabeth called back, adding the triumphant pose to her sketch. Miles looked over at her, his smile as heart-stopping as it had been the day they wed. The years had added a few lines around his eyes, a touch of silver at his temples, but he was still the handsome cowboy who had wrapped her and Hope in furs and called them family on that fateful winter day. As if sensing her thoughts, Miles waded out of the creek and made his way to her side, dropping down on the blanket beside her. "The fishing instructor is taking a break," he announced, peering at her sketch. "That's good. You've captured Hope's proud stance perfectly." "She gets that from her father," Elizabeth teased, leaning into him as his arm circled her waist. "And her determination from her mother," Miles countered, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Hard to believe she was once that tiny baby born too early in the middle of a blizzard." "Hard to believe any of this sometimes," Elizabeth agreed, gesturing to their children, their life together. "But then I look at you and I know it's all real." Miles's arm tightened around her. "Very real," he assured her, "and better than any dream I could have had." They sat in companionable silence, watching their children. Michael had taken over the fishing lesson for Joshua, showing infinite patience as the little boy's line tangled for the third time. Hope and Emma were now engaged in a splash fight, their laughter echoing across the water. "I was thinking," Miles said after a while, "that we might go into town for the Independence Day celebration next week. The children would enjoy the festivities, and it's been a while since we've seen the Hendersons and the others." "That sounds wonderful," Elizabeth agreed. "It would be nice to show off the new painting at the county fair, too." Her landscapes had become quite sought after, with several hanging in the homes of wealthy ranchers and even in the territorial governor's mansion. "You'll win first prize again," Miles predicted. "No one captures the beauty of this land like you do," Elizabeth smiled. "I have the advantage of special inspiration," she said, nodding toward their children. "This land, this life, this family, it's all connected. When I paint the mountains or the valley, I'm really painting us, our story." "A good story," Miles said softly, "the best I know." "And still being written," Elizabeth reminded him, placing her hand over his. "Every day, every year." Miles turned his hand to clasp hers, their fingers intertwining as naturally as breathing. "I love you, Elizabeth Walker," he said, the words as heartfelt now as they had been when first spoken. "And I love you, Miles Walker," she replied, "now and always." A shout from the creek drew their attention. Joshua had finally caught a small fish and was dancing with excitement, the others cheering him on. Miles and Elizabeth exchanged a smile, then rose together to join their children by the water's edge, walking hand in hand into the future they had built together, one day at a time, in the heart of the wild west they called home.